Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and possibly good morning and also good evening. I'm Philip Hewitt-Trebour, and I have the great pleasure to be chairman of the Masterpiece Fair, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first of our 4 Masterpiece online webinars. Masterpiece offers limitless opportunities for our visitors to look and learn about works of art by engaging with our passionate and knowledgeable exhibitors at our physical fair and the wonderful works of art that they bring to us. Sadly, we have not this year had the opportunity so to do. However, as from tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. London time, you can visit Masterpiece online at masterpiecefair.com, where over 120 of our exhibitors are offering for sale approximately 1,300 wonderful works of art of all periods and origins, from classical antiquity to contemporary and from all corners of the globe. Our new website allows you to search by artist, exhibitor, material, date, origin, or any combination indeed of price. But my favorite way to explore our website is through our automatic serendipitous selection of works of art, which echoes the cross-collecting ethos of Masterpiece. There's always something new to look at, and I think when you see objects juxtaposed differently, one next to the other, either physically or digitally, you begin to look at things in different ways. Yesterday in London, we were very happy to launch our Masterpiece Collectors Club, and the topic of today's webinar, Next Gen Collecting, Sustaining Art and Culture, is therefore singularly appropriate. I would very much like to thank all our wonderful speakers for participating in what I know is going to be a truly stimulating conversation, and additionally, to extend my heartfelt thanks to Michael Diaz-Griffith, who serves on our Masterpiece Collectors Club committee, to introduce our speakers and get the conversations underway. Michael.
Well, thank you so much, Philip, for having me with you today. And thank you to the whole Masterpiece team for facilitating this discussion. It's about a topic that I'm quite passionate about, collecting. And my background, as some of you know, is in antiques and the decorative arts, but I'm also interested in thinking about where collecting is headed more generally. And when we talk about collecting, it can be tempting to think that we're all talking about the same thing, using the same definition. In reality, though, collecting practices vary greatly from collector to collector. Many are, great connoisseurs of art, antiques, and design, while others may be investors in what they might see as a class of alternative investments. That's not our kind of collector, but I think you know what I mean. Some are collecting serially and perhaps obsessively in pursuit of a private passion, while others are scrupulously assembling collections they may plan to give to institutions someday, perhaps to help lend visibility to a previously ignored artist or a minoritized culture. This fair, Masterpiece, has rather famously and brilliantly popularized cross-collecting, or collecting between disciplines and periods, a concept that resonates with me and I know with so many others today. Besides a penchant for cross-collecting, though, what else sets the next generation of collectors apart from their predecessors? As it turns out, a great deal, as our 4 brilliant panelists today will reveal. And I'm really honored to be speaking with them. I'll give brief introductions, but first we have Dana Faruqi, a curator and patron of Middle Eastern art. Christina Makris, a collector and author of a forthcoming book on art in restaurants. Nish McCree, the patron and founder of the Cowrie Culture, which will be working in African countries to advance artistic contexts there. And Georgia Powell, the co-founder of Cura Art, another advisory service that works with collectors. And we'll be chatting with them in a moment. They'll be bringing perspectives from African, European, and Middle Eastern contexts to bear on these questions. And as we chat, I think you'll see that the practice of collecting is swiftly evolving and taking on new meanings. And it's also seeing the return and reinvention of some older meanings. In particular, the concept of patronage will loom large today. Among this group that we've assembled, there's an exciting focus on the role of the collector or patron in helping sustain artistic practices, just, artists, and helping nourish the cultural ecosystems or creative economies, the local communities in which they flourish. Broadly, in the contemporary art context, it feels as if we're seeing a shift in focus from objects to people, from the individual to the community, and from serial acquisition, which we still love and which I am a big fan of, to new and exciting models of collecting or patronage that emphasize sustained support. To kick us off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists a question that relates very specifically to their practice. And to begin, I'll ask you, Georgia, a question that is related to the sort of overall theme of today. I mean, this discussion is very closely aligned with your work. And you've said that the philanthropic role of patrons is becoming increasingly vital for the support of artists and the arts more broadly. Can you tell us why, from your perspective, the role of patrons and collectors is becoming so important? Is it because there are issues in the arts that have not been sufficiently addressed by public and private institutions, perhaps? Or are there just new opportunities for collectors to support artists and art communities in the digital age? Or a bit of both? We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Go ahead.
I should just first start by saying thank you to Philip and Michael and to Masterpiece for having me. That's a big question to start with, but I will try. And just to start, it's definitely in line with what we do. So we founded Cura Art to help collectors fully harness this potential as both responsible custodians of cultural heritage, but also as supporters and patrons of creatives themselves, as you said. But we also saw an increasing appetite for this, so a more sort of conscientious approach to collecting. That's definitely not to say that it didn't happen before. Obviously, it's something that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, but it seemed that it was happening with more rigor and within a global context, as you've said. So things that we've noticed is a sense of responsibility towards the work, a greater understanding that art and precious objects are fragile, need to be taken care of. I think Plowden and Smith sponsoring Masterpiece in 2019 is testament to that. And that will be increasingly important as contemporary artists begin to experiment with medium. We know how paintings age, so conservation will be increasingly important to collectors going forward. We've noticed, and I'd be really interested to know what the collectors have to say on this, but a sort of greater responsibility to the artists. And I've been thinking about why that might be. And maybe it's platforms like Instagram, social media. Does that make artists more accessible? Does it make them more human? And therefore, you can literally tell the sense of responsibility to support them. And it's actually a relatively new phenomenon for artists to have their own website. I know when I was managing Red Fern Gallery only 10 years ago, every artist didn't have their own website. I would still have artists come in with physical portfolios to show me what they created. So I feel like the globalization of the art world had an impact at creating better relationships with collectors and artists. But I'd be really interested to see if the collectors agree with that, whether Instagram plays a role. I feel like there's been a broadening of the subject. So we're seeing more people collecting, but also more people were collecting with focus. So as you say, either focusing their acquisitions on readdressing a concern that's close to their heart, or readdressing a group of artists that may have been underrepresented in the past. And then, as you said, sort of philanthropy and support of arts institutions more broadly. A collector that springs to mind is Valeria Napoleone, who started all these initiatives in partnership with arts institutions. I mean, it's also no secret that there's a lack of funding to arts institutions. So I feel like increasingly collectors can play a really vital role within this context. Obviously, the rise of the art market will have had an impact. So museums may now be priced out of the market. So all of the sort of contemporary masterpieces, but also we've seen, you know, works from history that are being purchased by private collectors. So there will be a sense in sort of 10, 20 years maybe that all of these works will be in private hands. And so museum standard works need to be cared for in the same way that they would be in a museum. And also that sort of responsibility to provide access to them then will be key. But it's also worth pointing out that the sort of possibilities and resources of private collections that aren't sort of limited in the way that I know we'll talk about later maybe, that institutions are. It seems like private collectors are much freer, and that leads on to the point that you asked in your question about whether I think it's that the institutions haven't sufficiently addressed and whether it's that shortfall that collectors are sort of stepping in to fulfill the role. And I think it's difficult to compare. As I've mentioned, Valeria, she has the sort of freedom and she can be reactionary and move forward with speed, but also be introspective in a way that museums definitely can't. They have to be extremely considered and democratic, wear many hats, and their resources, you know, can only be stretched so far. They're also inextricably sort of connected to their own histories that they can't get away from. So yeah, I hope that answers the sort of broad question.
That's a brilliant beginning, Georgia. And I feel like we'll be picking out themes from that, your response throughout the whole discussion. So thank you.
Of course.
And more soon on all of those ideas. But Nish, I'd like to turn to you now and sort of shift perspectives a bit as you're a patron and also working within contexts where you focus on institution building. So you have a unique kind of duality of focus on both your practice and on a broader context. And you're aiming to build a base of new collectors and patrons to help grow and sustain domestic art ecosystems across Africa. I mean, which is a brilliant goal. And as you've said, and it's ambitious. And I think we'll talk a lot about it today. But to kind of kick things off, you know, I want to know how you're going about building that base of support, both as Nish, as the cowrie culture, and as a sort of, you know, ethical actor in this space of a new kind of patronage. What role, and additionally, what role do you see those outside of Africa, you know, the diaspora in particular, as playing in that?
Michael, thank you so much for this grand question. It's really quite one that I think we can think about in several ways. But first, again, I just want to thank Masterpiece for having me. It's such a delight to be here with you all and with the panelists. And I'm really excited for the participants. So thank you very much. So yes, I mean, it is very ambitious as a goal. I think that it requires some sense of audacity to think of having that kind of impact. But for me, Michael, you mentioned the cowrie culture. So the cowrie culture is a platform and advisory that I will launch later next month. And it really is all about the expansion and sustainability of the contemporary art ecosystem in Ghana, where I live, but across the continent. And the only way to really do that, Michael, is in partnership, as you can imagine. But to your point about building a collector base, which I think is a key component of the work of that expansion and sustainability, is looking at, for me, 4 ways of entry points. And the first is, of course, the launching of the platform to sort of formalize the work and see how to engage people on a consistent basis. The other is looking at pop-up exhibitions, which I think allows people who may not be collectors or who are new to the art community to experience art, to see it in person, and to feel like they can be a part of that experience of what it means to be in the audience of art or as a part of the experience of art. I think also a part of it is there's going to be an opportunity for some exciting digital engagements, potentially some online courses and things like that I think could be appealing to a new kind of collector. And I would also say that part of it is about rebranding and demystifying the concept of being an art collector. I think that's really important for this part of the world. Again, I mentioned I'm in Ghana, West Africa, and we have a lot of activity going on in the way of the creativity of the art and that aspect of contemporary art. But for the collector base and the patron base, we really do have quite a bit of work to do to engage more people who would like to support the larger ecosystem and help it to expand, particularly, as you mentioned, in that way of domestic economies. So within Ghana, what can you do to be a patron within your domestic art community, which is going to then in turn benefit the economy of that place. And then you mentioned the diaspora. I absolutely think there's a role for diaspora. I mean, I am a part of the African diaspora. And if you look at the numbers, Michael, you'll see that approximately 420 million people make up the African diaspora. That's larger than the population of the United States and Great Britain combined. So it's quite a large number of people. If you strip out those that aren't eligible, like the kids and the such, I mean, it's a pretty large adult population. And I think that the diaspora, given some of the advantages that those of us in the diaspora may have had, I think there's a role for patronage, particularly looking at how we're thinking about supporting emerging galleries, emerging artist in residency programs, really looking at some of those training opportunities and institutions that are a bit fledgling and helping those get established with some endowments and things like that. So definitely think there's a role for all of us to engage who are part of the diaspora, as well as those of us who are here in place.
Brilliant and enlightening. And once again, I feel that we've just sort of touched on several topics that will become currents throughout the whole conversation. So
absolutely. Yes.
Now, Christina, I'd like to invite you on screen, and let's have a bit of a pivot. Now, Christina is a brilliant polymath and does all sorts of things, including collecting the work of emerging artists, which is a practice that connects everyone in this discussion. But you're also passionate about 20th century modern art. And so since we're in the context of cross-collecting here, I wanted to ask for you to expand on something you mentioned to me the other day. Now, you have a background in philosophy, and you made a very profound point when we were talking, and you said something like that we do or should behave differently in the midst of an artwork. You sort of brought a spirit of ethical consideration to the way that we live with art and objects that parallels the types of ethical considerations we'll be discussing today in the context of patronage. So, instead of the responsibility we feel towards living artists and their context, you were invoking considerations to do with objects and their histories. And I thought that really symbolized the way in which all types of collecting are sort of moving towards this very nuanced, careful kind of ethical model. And so I just wanted to ask you to expand on that a little bit, since that's a unique perspective in this discussion as a 20th century collector.
Sure, thank you. I think, I approach collecting a little bit differently. I mean, I'm on this panel as a collector, but I am also a patron of various institutions, and I wear, a finance hat during the day. So, however, what's interesting, you mentioned, and I think we'll pick up on that, is there used to be an automatic connection that the next generation of collectors, that automatically meant contemporary art, that young people want contemporary art. Of course, that happens, and there are, we talked about the ecosystem and meeting artists and supporting artists, so that is there. But I think what's happening, and Georgia, you touched on this in terms of expanding and access, more new collectors, new generation, young generation are seeing themselves as collectors, setting themselves up as collectors, and they can access older works that they never think, you know, I have pieces that I never really thought that they would just be available. They would be in the market, or they would be available to buy from a dealer, and that's wonderful. So for me, because of I have an academic background, it's really exciting to have collections in my pieces in my home that I am, you know, there is a nostalgia, there is a transporting to a past. So say, you know, I do like 20th century, I collect Balthus works. So I have, you know, some of those pieces, and to be able to live with that and know that tangentially connects me to, you know, his coterie of that period in Paris, and it connects me to Bataille, to writers, to poets, to authors, to other painters, is wonderful. So I have a sort of old school approach in terms of how I collect. But in terms of living with objects and ethics of collecting, of course, we are custodians of artistic legacy and endeavors and aesthetics. And this is also what will differentiate artists and collectors from just acquiring luxury objects, commodities, things that you just plonk around without thinking about it. I do believe that there is an onus on collectors to think about what they do, to think about their approach, to, you know, almost to be obliged to come up with an elevator pitch or a motto or a philosophy or a reason as to why they do what they do, because you are taking an object out of its context, you know, out of the artist's hands, and you're doing so, you're bestowing onto it something new, a new meaning, because it's in your environment, it's in your life, it's privy to your daily existence. So there is something about that, and, you know, and we will leave these things behind, because artworks should actually outlast us, I think. So it's quite important. It's a very long-term pursuit. It's a long game.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of relationship you're describing with art positions the collector as a sort of steward of an artist's legacy, or as the steward of a cultural heritage, right? And there's something, we're talking about objects versus people, living artists, but there's a similar quality in this ethical relationship that I think is really fascinating, and we should continue to pick up on. So thank you, Christina. And for this sort of final kickoff question, we'll turn to Dana, who will join us on screen. And Dana, once again, there's so much we could discuss, but just to sort of narrow in on a specific topic, we'll want to hear all about your work in the Middle East and with Middle Eastern art, but you've given a great deal of support to New York institutions specifically, and you sit on the boards of several really important organizations that have made forays into Middle Eastern programming and into acquiring Middle Eastern art. And without necessarily naming names, I wonder if you could give us a sort of temperature check on how those initiatives are developing. And specifically, you know, to tell us what are some of the ways in which your position as a collector or as a patron, as someone who has a direct relationship with artists, help you affect the change you wish to see in institutions. And this is a question about the museum world, I think, and it's also a question about your position within it and how being a patron helps with that.
So yeah, I mean, I kind of came to focus on the Middle East over time, and it wasn't kind of initially like that. When I studied art history in university, I actually wrote my thesis on a 20th century Russian artist who kind of who was involved in the ballet russe and you know, made paintings, but also made costumes and set designs for the Russian ballets. After graduating from university and pursuing my master's in London at the Courtauld, I started to actually kind of become more and more interested in museums in particular. And actually for my master's at the Courtauld, I did a museum theory program. And it was then that I started to think about, you know, how can I bridge my personal background with my passion, my interests, and my studies. And I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. So, you know, in many ways, I'm 100% American, but I'm a first generation family. I come from a first generation family. So I have Palestinian parents who have always kind of really emphasized the importance of our background and of our culture, and a mother who was, when I was a child, very much engaged in preserving kind of cultural legacies from the Middle East, and had a nonprofit platform that worked to do so. And so I started to think about, you know, my passion. It became clear that my passion was in museums, and that was a place that I felt was special and essential and important. And I started to think about kind of, you know, though there are very wonderful institutions that have existed for a long time in the many cultural capitals throughout the Middle East, I started kind of getting interested in kind of the idea of, you know, what would a museum dedicated to contemporary art look like in the region. And so for my master's thesis, I wrote about the possibility of, and at that moment, the Guggenheim had kind of started expanding globally. And so, you know, I wrote a case study on the ever expanding global Guggenheim, which, you know, was super contentious at the time, you know, spearheaded by Tom Krenz, who really innovated in terms of museum theory and kind of thinking about what a museum could be, and, you know, how it could exist across borders, and you know, had super ambitious plans for kind of taking a New York-based institution and having it exist in other places in the world, which really was rooted in the fact that a Guggenheim already existed in Venice through the Peggy Guggenheim. So there was a precedent for it, but I don't think there was a precedent necessarily for how he wanted, you know, the museum to kind of truly grow. And so I wrote on the global Guggenheim, and, you know, that idea, with the hopes that it would eventually lead me to a Guggenheim project in the Middle East, which it ultimately did. So after writing that thesis, I sent, you know, a copy of it to Tom Krenz, kind of begging him for a job, because I had heard that there were kind of rumblings about the possibility of a Guggenheim in the Middle East. And so I became the first staff hire for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi project, the first kind of curator working on that project. And it was an exciting time. And, you know, we were kind of thinking about museum building and collection building. And at the same time, you know, I still wanted to also increase the visibility of Middle Eastern arts at existing institutions. And so it was kind of, you know, working on a new project, but yet kind of also ensuring that, and this is especially true of the Guggenheim, ensuring that, you know, they had this crazy ambitious museum plan for Abu Dhabi, but that needed to be reflected at home base at, you know, their museum in New York. And so that's how, you know, one of the things I'm involved in is I founded the Middle East Circle at the Guggenheim in New York. And it's actually, you know, the mission is to increase visibility of Middle Eastern art at home base in order to kind of create a healthy balance to this ambitious project happening, you know, many thousands of miles away in Abu Dhabi. But yeah, I mean, you know, I've always just, I've, you know, tried to kind of support curatorial visions to kind of increase, to kind of make the narrative more global, and to kind of give visibility to specific artists, to support exhibitions that took place, like MoMA PS1, for example, the Iraq show curated by Peter Ely, the Willie Ride retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, and those kind of, you know, took place, you know, of course, because there was curatorial interest based on, you know, people working at the museum who had become kind of interested in presenting exhibitions from these artists. But I, became kind of part of those conversations because I traveled with the curators often. We kind of discovered things together. And yeah, I think, it's important to me to kind of do work in the Middle East, but also ensure that, my work includes kind of promoting visibility in New York, where I'm now living and kind of, at home.
Yeah. And this is interesting because there's a cross current here with Nish's work. We were just describing the ways the diaspora could contribute to the advancement of Nish's goals, in African context. So there's a kind of globalism, but it's a globalism in this conversation that's focused on exchange and on equity, as opposed to sort of extractive logic or tokenism, right? In the case.
And I left out, like Nish, I recently moved back to New York, but I spent, almost 8 years living in Dubai. And so that became my home as well. And it was, they were important years in my life. My kids were young. It was, kind of where we became very much at home there. And so it made it even more important to me to kind of continue that conversation even after we moved back to New York.
So Dana, you've talked about institution building, but we've also talked a bit about the impact of a direct personal connection with artists. And in fact, that connection has come up in every chat I've had with this whole group. It's a really key theme. So could you just tell us a little bit about what you get from that direct personal interaction with artists? And then I would invite everyone to add to that. In Georgia, you can also provide maybe insight from your collectors and the experiences you've lived in that context.
Yeah, at some point I kind of had this light bulb moment, which I think sounds a little silly now, but when you kind of buy a work of art from the primary market, you're essentially, assisting an artist to continue making art and to kind of continue being an artist. And it was kind of funny when I just kind of, there's so many steps in between that make it seem, a bit more abstract, but that's essentially what is happening, and so though they're not, at the art fair, the artist is not kind of there when you're kind of, buying a work of art or seeing it, and you're not, or there may not be at the gallery when you're kind of visiting on a weekend if you're not there at the opening. That's what's happening. And so, yeah, I kind of, very early on decided to focus on, collecting living artists from the primary market. And yeah, and there's so many other kind of avenues to collect, and they're very valuable as well. But to me, that, that kind of like really direct support was, a meaningful way of being a patron. So yeah, so that's what's happening. And I feel like, if you're visiting Masterpiece kind of when it happens in person later, or visiting it online, though you might not realize what's kind of really going on, when you're kind of in a viewing room and it doesn't really feel like you're doing anything related to an artist at that moment, that's truly what's happening, is you're allowing an artist to continue making work.
And this really connects to Georgia's insight about Instagram, right? And really understanding the reality that artists are people who are living in the material world with us, and they need money to keep going in their practices. It really is that simple on some level. And in Georgia, I would sort of add to this for you. Which groups have you found to be most responsive to this shift? We can all imagine the cliche of a collector who may only care about the work and not necessarily the life of the artist. But we've identified this trend, this theme of actually caring about the lives of the artists.
Yeah.
They're collecting and thinking about their world. So who's responding?
Yeah, a big part of what we do is encouraging collectors to understand their value when it comes to supporting artists outside of just acquisition. So like we've talked about collector-artist relationships. And I think really encouraging collectors and patrons to understand that they could have significant impact on an artist's career through not only sort of promotion of their work and art, kind of explaining an artistic intention. So say if they have a work in their home, for instance, they can encourage patronage to probably like-minded people through their own example. It's much more sort of accessible and easy to understand collecting when somebody you know also does it, rather than a big institution, which can sometimes seem intimidating. So I don't think collectors can really undervalue that role that they can have in inspiring further patronage, which is obviously vital, as you said, to artists. There's so many opportunities that they can help outside of that. So obviously preserving an artistic legacy through a conservation is huge. So promotion and research through loans is also significant. And it's also important to point out that it's not just contemporary artists that you can help in that way. The Eileen Agar show that's currently on at the Whitechapel Gallery in London relied so heavily on loans to stage the exhibition. And so you're adding, by lending a work from your private collection to an exhibition like that, you're adding to the curator's story, but also you're adding to this kind of readdressing of Eileen Agar herself, but also women artists from art history. So that links into Christina's approach to collecting. It's not just, you can actually support and help artists retrospectively, even if they're not contemporary. But yeah, there seems to be so many ways, even things like artists' studio tours. It seems like, as you've said, Instagram and social media and the internet has allowed us into their world much more. And I think that collectors can definitely help artists on those platforms. So things like, I've noticed a lot of sort of collector artist interviews on Instagram TV and things like that, but also just using that actual resources. So supporting grants, awards. There's a brilliant award in the UK that's run by the Ingram Collection. It's called the Ingram Prize, which is an annual award, but also with things like residencies. Nish is a wonderful patron for our soon to be launched residency. So there are so many other ways outside of just acquiring an artist's work. But also you've asked if there was a sort of particular group. I think, to be honest, it is people that are new to collecting, or this next generation, as I say, and it doesn't necessarily mean by age either. People can come to collecting later on in life, but I think for all of the reasons we've talked about, there seems to be this sense of responsibility towards the artist and to the work itself.
And even to contexts, including historical contexts.
Definitely.
Which is brilliant.
Just to add to Georgia's point as well, I think also it's a great, it's a very good way. I mean, I also have living artists in my collection and I love meeting them and I love having them convince me of their aesthetics and why they do what they do and why they make those decisions and why that looks the way it looks because they chose that or they were thinking about that or they researched that. That's just wonderful when you're just seduced by, you know, an artist's practice and, you know, ideas. But of course, a really great way of beginning as a collector and supporting artists is of course through the institutional patron programs. And we've mentioned a few in the US and I'm a member of a few in the UK. So I think every collector should sign up to be a patron of at least one place wherever they are in their city. And again, that will give you interesting insights. You will also meet other younger collectors, people who are interested in exploring and taking the same journey as you. And of course, the institutions need the support as well. So it's extremely important to, at the very least, do that.
And that's also a takeaway from today's talk that hopefully others can apply in their own lives or share with the potential young collectors in them. To kind of build on that, Nish, what is your advice for collectors or patrons who are interested in supporting African artists and art ecosystems? So, I mean, we can join a museum's patron program. Check. We're going to do that. What else can can young collectors or new collectors, this new type of patron, do to engage?
Sure, no, thank you. Well, first of all, if you're really new, I think you can start by learning, right? There's so much to learn, to read, to engage with in the digital space. So many wonderful resources as we all learn through COVID, and even this great talk today. I mean, we're all around the world, and yet we're able to interface and learn from each other and have these kinds of wonderful exchanges. So I definitely think there's this role for learning and taking that on really seriously. Another part of that experience is, you know, for me, I think when you're new, and even if you've been at it for a long time, I think it's important to look at art every day. I mean, obviously, if you're already an established collector, you're walking by it in your home, you're experiencing it every day. But I think for people who are interested in getting into collecting, I would say look at art every day. I mean, Georgia talked about Instagram, and again, there's so many online viewing rooms, and I mean, just really world-class caliber art that you can see right from your home, from your computer. And then now with things opening up again and going to institutions, I think that's pretty important. I would also say get a mentor or a friend-tor, someone who's already a collector, who can help guide you and give you some of their tips and tricks and ways of thinking about collecting, and maybe even share with you some of the lessons and mistakes they've made, or if you think you've made a mistake in your collecting practice. But they could certainly help you, and it's also fun just to share with another collector just the learning of a new artist. It's like, oh my gosh, you are not going to believe this, Dana, I just found this new young artist. I think that kind of exchange is really exciting, and doing that with a newer collector who's learning, I think, would be encouraging. The other thing that I actually also noted, I don't want to forget, is establishing relationships. So important. So wherever you are in your local art community, I think it's great if you can just get involved, go to a gallery, go to a museum, go to art talks, really meet people who are part of the ecosystem, who are doing exciting things, and who are willing to answer your questions and help you understand what's going on in that local community, and how you can be involved. And then the last thing I would say is just have fun. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to be exciting and engaging. It's meant to enrich your life, art. And the practice of collecting is something that I think once you're in it, it's so easy to get almost obsessed with it, but certainly for the right reasons, for that notion of being a custodian and being a good carer of the work. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
It's fabulous advice. And we should turn to Dana with the same question. If someone is interested in collecting Middle Eastern art or becoming a patron who's active in the space that you work in, Dana, where are the opportunities to engage, and what factors should they keep in mind, as they seek to be a truly supportive patron and not an extractive collector in your space?
My suggestion would be, and this is kind of one of my favorite parts about, being engaged in this world, in the art world, is to travel. I mean, traveling, there's nothing that beats kind of traveling to a biennial or a fair. I mean, I love discovering new artists through biennials. I feel like, that like, for example, the Sharjah Biennial, which happens in the UAE every other year. And now that the world is reopening again, and we hopefully will all be reunited, I don't think, there's anything as much fun as kind of attending one of these. You either go during the opening or not necessarily, and you get to kind of, be introduced to a whole group of artists, often kind of, based locally and throughout the region, who are there and they're placed within this context and within a theme, and or traveling to an art fair, or traveling to Desert X in the new desert in Saudi Arabia. I mean, and people kind of, I think, perhaps are intimidated by taking these trips. But again, if you affiliate yourself with a museum, often museums will kind of happily take you there, and some of the best trips I've ever taken have been, you know, along with an institution, and you know, and then they take you to people's homes. You know, start to understand the culture. You get to go to artist studios, and that's kind of a phenomenal way of doing things. I agree that I love going to artist talks where artists kind of explain their work, give presentations. I think there's nothing better than hearing it from the artists themselves. And I think, you know, to see as much as possible, to read as much as possible. And I agree that I think, you know, the kind of silver lining of COVID has been this like exceptional online programming that's now offered by every single institution across the board. And there's no one that's not doing this. And so if, you know, we can identify, you know, the top platforms located in the region, that is going to give you the best discovery, you know, like Art Jamil, that's based in both Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, a great private museum that's doing world-class programming. The Sharjah Biennial, again, in Lebanon, Homeworks, an exceptional kind of biennial program in art school, Darat al-Funun in Jordan, the Townhouse Gallery in Cairo. I mean, there are kind of so many places that are that have been active for so long and have these incredible roots within the cultural communities, and offer us kind of real and deep understanding into, you know, the artists of the region and the cultural landscapes of that part of the world.
More brilliant takeaways. And as we narrow in on our final 10 minutes, everyone, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A box. We have, as you can see, wonderful resources in these friends we've assembled here for the chat who have so much knowledge about not just the arts, but specific opportunities in the regions that they focus on. So please feel free to sort of type any questions into the Q&A box as we move towards our conclusion. But before we get there, I'd love the sort of forward-looking direction that we've taken. And I want to turn to Georgia and Christina with forward-looking questions before we conclude. And Georgia, I would just ask you, both as an arts professional as well as someone who works with patrons, can you give us some specific examples of how you see this evolution continuing to evolve in the next 10 years? And, you know, what would be a dream project for one of the patrons you work with, or indeed for you as this context develops?
I think, to be honest, I just foresee these relationships between artists and collectors growing. I think that there needs to be a much more sort of joined up art world. So it's really inspiring to hear the collectors talk about working in partnership with institutions. I think that is absolutely key, that everything is joined up, because otherwise it will just stay as this sort of segmented reality. So I think that that's really key, and making the most of this globalized art world that has been, as Dana was saying, has been sort of emphasized through the last 18 months, that we can all access art in a new way, and we can communicate even though we're not in the same place. And it would be great if that was sort of the focus going forward, that the emphasis was on creating a global approach, encouraging more people into collecting. And not even, I mean, I know in the talk's description, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be collecting to be part of it as well. I think encouraging more people into arts generally would be wonderful. And I'd say the dream project would just be to highlight, maybe in an exhibition, the importance of collectors, both from history and today. So if there's some kind of exhibition that we could work on that was hopefully sort of inspiring. I mean, you know, works from art history, Botticelli's Birth of Venus wouldn't exist if it wasn't for a patron inspiring and supporting it. And that is equally important today. So an exhibition that really highlighted the important role of the collector within this system. Museums are built on, a lot of the time, private collections.
Absolutely.
So I feel like the collector needs to be, the private collector needs to be sort of highlighted as fundamental from history, but equally more important going forward.
And I know that you're a fan of Sir John Soane's museum, which I am involved in at the foundation level. So perhaps we in Masterpiece should link up and do some kind of celebration of collectors there. Christina, I love that this word partnership has emerged now twice in both of the preceding comments, and it also emerged in our preparatory chat. I mean, I know you see yourself as a sort of partner of the institutions that you work with. And do you have, you know, a sense of how you'd like for that partnership to evolve as your patronage develops, both as an individual and as someone who's deeply involved in the lives of the museums you support?
Sure. Now, remember, being a partnership means that, you know, usually with collectors, you think that they call the shots because of the, you know, contract, the economics of it. But of course, a partnership means that you also respect, you know, that time is money also for artists and for institutions. So it actually means collectors should take a backseat and not necessarily assume and, you know, expect and have certain aspects of entitlement. So, you know, so I think, and of course, this last year has also shown how much support artists need and, you know, and institutions need. So I think that has probably, hopefully, to an ethical, conscious collector has driven that point home a bit more. So yeah, so I think it's important to be respectful of artists, what they do, not make unrealistic demands on them. They are a business. They also have, you know, I have to count for my hours, you know, and I cost my time up. They do too. So I think, you know, that aspect is pretty important, and a little bit more of the partnership shifting to bring the artists, you know, however you want to look at that is important.
No, I think that's such a key point, and it also sort of reflects the approach to volunteerism that I've been identifying in the nonprofit world among millennials and young and new supporters of institutions, sort of a spirit of showing up and saying, how can I help? What do you need? Instead of coming with a proposal about what you want to give, right? And again, we're sort of looking, you're describing a dialogue, right, that the collector enters into with the institution. And this has been a wonderful dialogue with each of you, both preparing for this discussion and chatting today. It's not going to end now, but we can shift into the Q&A. And for everyone in the audience, you know, we'll try to keep this Q&A brief, but if you need to go, please feel free. And for those who want to remain, we'll answer as many of your questions as we can. So I'm just going to take a look at the Q&A box here, and I encourage each of the panelists to do the same. And let's just begin with one that I think is fun for anyone to think about, which it's a universal question. And it's, was there an experience or a work of art that triggered your collecting journey, or has it grown organically over time? Can you identify a specific moment, or was there a process that you could talk to us about? And for that, I would ask Nish to share with us, and then we can maybe go around in a circle. Oh, Nish, you're still muted. Sorry.
Sorry, yes. Is this Alessandra's question?
It's Lucy Kitchener's question. Was there an experience or
yes. Oh, wonderful. Yes. Lucy, thank you for this question. I will give you a very, very brief answer, but I really got started or triggered to want to collect art from my grandmother, from my paternal grandmother. When I was a little girl, we would spend time at her house, and it was just a treasure trove of so many things. I mean, she just had things everywhere, and so many little mini collections of things, jewelry, cards. We made ceramics together. We fired them in her kiln together at home. She made quilts, and it, I think, informed my idea about living with beautiful things very early on. And while I didn't consider, the idea of collecting at the time, looking back as an adult, living in Washington, D.C., going to the national museums, and then getting really intentional about collecting, I sort of reflected back and had to say, I think this seed was planted early on with my grandmother, and just that impression it made on me very early on in life. So yeah, I would definitely say in those early days, and then as an adult, just living in Washington, D.C. and being inspired by all the national museums and wanting to get very intentional about collecting. Yeah.
Brilliant. Dana, Georgia, Christina?
Well, my collecting journey began. I mean, my mother we're Greek, so we tradition of Byzantine icons. So she has many, and antique and collectible icons. So that's where I learned that these objects that you hang on your walls are special things. They're mystical. They're infused with meaning. So it was that childhood, it's instilled in me. And then then actually through just school, for some reason, a lot of my friends in school went off to become artists, to train as classical artists, and you want a piece of your friends, as it were. So very early on, I would ask my friends to give me works that they had done. So yeah, and then it just and then it just continued, and then you start going to fairs and going to galleries, and the obsession starts and hasn't ended yet. So.
Dana?
Yeah, I mean, I also grew up kind of seeing a lot of art with my mom and with my parents, and kind of it being what we did together. And my mom will often say that I gave her like tons of trouble, and I was a very difficult child, but I never complained on museum visits, even when I was super, super young. So, I think, I always loved looking at art. And I think, again, it was kind of like this light bulb moment when I was studying art history at Brown, and you often kind of start from the beginning. And I wasn't super aware of kind of contemporary art until later on in my studies, when I took a course with a visiting professor, and and started to realize that I could kind of also be looking at kind of things that were made just recently. And I think that was that always excited me. And I went to my first art fair was Art Basel, because when I was in college, I became very close friends with a girl from Basel. And so, she was like, every summer we have this kind of crazy art fair that happens. You guys should come. So a group of us went when we were like sophomores to Basel for the art fair. And it was the first time I'd been to a fair, and and that fair is pretty epic, in every way. And so that kind of opened my eyes to this kind of like primary market, which I wasn't as familiar with. I was a museum goer, but I wasn't kind of as familiar with the primary market. And so I was like, this is where I want to be, and this is how I want to spend my days.
And so you have. Now, Georgia, I want you to share that experience with us, but I'm going to fold in something else. Something interesting has happened. Almost every question in the Q&A asks, how do you start an art collection? How do you start a collection of 20th century art? Manny asks if perhaps the previously rather esoteric world of collecting and contemporary art culture may be becoming more accessible as post-COVID, and adds sort of that children are innately interested in collecting, but the thread seems to be lost. do panelists have any ideas or efforts that they could relate regarding engaging youth, keeping the flame, the interest in collecting going? So there's just a really interesting set of questions here about how to sort of stoke the fires that we've all been discussing just now, as we move through the next years of our practices, and maybe what can others do to help encourage collecting. So Georgia, we want to hear about your private passion, but also how do you recommend people get started, and how to encourage them?
Well, I wouldn't be, this raises another point, but I wouldn't profess to be a collector like the other three are, but that's something that we also try to encourage, is that it's actually quite hard to say I'm a collector.
Yeah.
To get to that stage, because that word has so much responsibility attached to it. But like the other three panelists, my love of art came from my grandparents and my parents, and just being surrounded by it, and thankfully taken to museums, and yes, so it's a similar sort of trajectory. But I think heeding the advice that the three panelists have said is basically just make sure that you're constantly learning and visiting museums and galleries, and you can't help but be inspired. And also this last sort of 18 months has been encouraging more people into collecting. So I'm sure it's made it across to America, but in the UK, there's been this wonderful thing on Instagram called the Artist Support Pledge, and works start at £200. So it means it's a sort of really accessible way into collecting. So I'd say that the more that you learn and the more time you spend learning about artists, you can't help but be inspired and gain an appetite for it, I'd say. And there is always ways into it that can be more accessible, and then you can grow from that base, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. And it feels as if people have been buying on Instagram,
definitely,
en masse for the first time, really, during the pandemic. And it's really worth emphasizing that, and I think in our discussion here, price does not factor in the question of whether or not one is a collector, right? If you bought a work of art, even if it's for $100 or pounds, or a work of contemporary design, that counts. And if we're thinking of children, collecting leaves and rocks and those things also count. And actually some of the great collectors, collected artifacts that they found in their natural environments, etc. So having a really open vision of collecting, I think, is part of what makes it accessible.
Well, then that starts with childhood, because everybody collects
exactly
My Little Ponies and
so let's continue with that, in further responses, because I think everyone wants to think about how we continue collecting. But perhaps as a final question that really speaks to the moment we're in the art world, Tina asks, as a collector or as someone who helps collectors, Georgia, does transparency of where the artworks or antiques came from, for example, if they were looted, etc., inform your choices? And maybe you're thinking about, how we continue on in the market in terms of making decisions around acquisitions. Dana, Nish, please feel free also to speak to that.
I'm happy to step in. I think it's a really sort of important conversation, and it's obviously something that museums are talking about at the moment. But from the perspective of collecting, I'd say that provenance, so an object's history, is absolutely vital to understanding before acquisition. And equally understanding your part in that work's provenance. So making sure that you keep an invoice or a record of sale, and keep up to date information about the works in your collection, but absolutely the provenance. And that's why a fair like Masterpiece that has gone through a vetting process, you are reassured completely that the work's provenance is as best as it can be.
Yeah. Dana?
Again, I don't think I've had to kind of, I agree that provenance is really important. And And I don't think I've had to kind of interact with kind of some of these issues raised, which I think are super important issues, you know, because I'm also kind of, you know, collecting living artists and mainly through the primary market. But, you know, I think it's, you know, essential to be kind of mindful of where things came from and to kind of ensure that they were, you know, that's why I also kind of admire like a primary market way of doing things, because, you know, the artist is really involved. You know, I mean, there is a transparent process happening there. And so it makes me feel more comfortable.
And maybe in the primary market, the focus is on ensuring that all of the partners are ethical actors who are behaving in a transparent manner in the business sense, right? So maybe you have a fabulous artist, but is the gallery also as fabulous, right? And on and on. Well, this is all really wonderful. We have a few very specific questions for individual panelists that I think they'll be able to answer one-on-one with those who pose those questions, because we'll have your email address if you submitted a question. So we'll wrap up the main discussion, but please look out if you asked a very specific question for a response. And we are just so grateful to everyone for joining us today for what I hope is the first of many discussions about this topic. Thank you, of course, especially to Dana, Christina, Nish, Georgia, and Masterpiece.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It's been great.